This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author Michael Lobel to discuss his new book, Van Gogh and the End of Nature. Lobel offers a groundbreaking reassessment of Vincent van Gogh, revealing how the artist's work is deeply intertwined with the industrial age and its environmental impacts. In the conversation, we explore how Van Gogh's art, often seen as a pure reflection of nature, is in fact a poignant commentary on the era's ecological challenges, making his work profoundly relevant to today's environmental concerns. And now, a reevaluation of Van Gogh's world with author Michael Lobel. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Michael, you are the author of a new book, Van Gogh and the End of Nature. I just completed your book, loved reading it, and want to have you on to have a conversation. You know, probably a good place to start is you start your book with painting a picture of being at a talk at a museum and just being really frustrated with the narrative. Tell us where the germ of this idea for this book came from.
So, Craig, first of all, I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your interest in the book. I have a lot of ways to talk about how this book originated. One way would be to say that this is the at least second or third iteration of me trying to write a book on Van Gogh. A few years ago, I started and completed a book on Van Gogh, which was more of sort of a mystery detective story about investigating a single painting by Van Gogh, which I think is a very meaningful one, but that has sort of been very overlooked. And I wasn't quite sure that book was working, so I put it down. It's still on my computer, and I'd sort of like to return to it one day. And then I started writing a second book, which had a series of chapters all based in different locales that Van Gogh lived and worked in. So The Hague, Nuenen, Paris, Arles, and Auvers-sur-Oise, which is where he died. And this book, Van Gogh and the End of Nature, was a chapter in that book. And the chapter got longer and longer and longer. And at some point, I realized, oh, this is a book unto itself. But another way of understanding the genesis of the book, as you're saying, and I talk about this in the introduction, is that one of the major ways of framing Van Gogh and his art is through the notion of him as an artist who is completely immersed in the natural world, right? Like he would be out in the fields and the woods, studying leaves and grasses and trees. And that's absolutely true. This is an artist who was deeply obsessed with and invested in looking at natural forms. I mean, amazingly, that's what makes his art so powerful and so beloved. But what I realized at some point is that, to me, it misrepresented who he was as a historical person. And so one of the main points, if not the main point of the book, is to say, wait a minute, Vincent van Gogh was someone who was living during a time of widespread and intense industrialization. Mm-hmm. And how do we see that in his work? And so for me, as you pointed out in the introduction, what I say is I think many of the prevailing stories and myths and narratives about Van Gogh that we have to date see him through the lens of nature. And I just, as you said earlier, you used the term thought experiment. What would it be like to think about Van Gogh in the industrial age?
Given that perspective, reading your book, I feel like you kind of take us down this path to reevaluate. It almost becomes a drinking game to spot the smokestacks, right? Just how many smokestacks show up in Van Gogh's work.
So, Craig, I'm glad you brought that up. So, I want to step back, because I talked about sort of the genesis for the book and also this kind of idea of thinking about Van Gogh as a denizen or inhabitant of the industrial age. And I want to say, if that was the only point or the only goal of the book, I think it would not be a very strong or powerful book. But for me, one of the primary goals, if not the central goal of the book, is to look more closely at Van Gogh's art. And ideally, and I think I accomplished this, I think it will be up to readers to decide whether I was successful. I think I was to actually look at Van Gogh's art in different ways and show us different things about the work that we haven't seen before. So in chapter 1, which is all about air pollution, I make the suggestion that I think a curator should put together an exhibition called Van Gogh Smokestacks, right? So first of all, that sounds lighthearted and kind of clever, but I'm totally serious. We have all of these exhibitions in recent years that are about Van Gogh and natural forms. So, and no shade on curators, and by the way, the Van Gogh industry is huge. Van Gogh brings people through the door, but we have Van Gogh cypresses and Van Gogh olive groves and Van Gogh in the Four Seasons. And if you actually look at his work, particularly the work he does in Arles in the south of France, there are smokestacks throughout them. And in fact, smokestacks are part of his work throughout his career. So in that chapter, I think one of my favorite illustrations in the book is in that chapter where I put together a series of 8 works by Van Gogh, all of them featuring factories and smokestacks. And by the way, in fact, there are probably, I counted them up. I made up a PowerPoint where I compiled all of the pictures by Van Gogh that feature smokestacks and factories. And it's at least 35 or 40. And I would love a curator to take that idea and run with it, because it would put a completely different spin on his work. And in fact, when I've showed, I've had proofs of the book and then I have an advanced copy. And when I've shown people that illustration, that series of 8 images by Van Gogh of smokestacks, they're completely surprised. And it's almost invariably the same response, which is, I've never thought about Van Gogh like that. And to me, I'm really excited about that, because that's what I'd like to do with the book, is actually have people see the work in a different way, see aspects of his work in a different way. And then finally, and I mean, we can get to this at some point in our conversation, also make connections between Van Gogh in the 19th century and our time.
I think it's interesting to consider subconscious versus conscious placement of these things, right? And I think just like us, the viewer, maybe we subconsciously never noticed the smokestacks. And we can make an argument that Van Gogh subconsciously wasn't thinking about the smokestacks. But when you start talking about trains, something that is in the process of moving by, and he's not working from a photograph, he's working plein air, representing what's in front of him. He's making a conscious decision to include a train in a painting. And the question is, why?
I think, like factories and smokestacks and coal mines and gas works, these were essential components of his world, right? The modern world of the 19th century he was living in, that he and other artists were confronting. And so I think you can step back and do a number of things. First of all, it's clear that many, many artists in that period, including the Impressionists, were thinking about the impact of trains and railway travel on how they saw the world and how they experienced the world. In fact, in advance of the book's release, it's going to be out next week, I'm writing up something for the magazine of the Museum of Modern Art in New York about Van Gogh. and modernity. And I was looking through MoMA's collection, and there are a series of prints, I think they're monotypes by Degas, um, which are these kind of hazy, almost abstract landscapes. And the anecdote is that according to Degas, he started thinking about the landscape in that way when he was looking at the window of a moving train. So first you start and say, this isn't just Van Gogh. So many artists in that period are thinking about how trains and railway travel are impacting their experience, how they see the world. In the book, I reproduce at least one of Monet's images of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris, with this smoke pouring out of the locomotive. But then there's a more specific point I make in the book about Van Gogh, which is about his time in Arles. So just for people who are listening who don't know all the details of Van Gogh's life and sort of career trajectory, in early 1888, he has spent 2 years in Paris, and he leaves Paris and goes to the south of France, to this large town or city called Arles. And the book focuses a lot on his period in Arles because, again, getting back to the kind of conventional narratives of the Van Gogh literature, a lot of people frame his departure from Paris and his move to Arles. And by the way, Arles is where he moves into the yellow house. He makes the sunflowers. A lot of people frame that as him escaping the city and industrial modernity into nature, right? The south of France, the sun-drenched landscapes, the fields around Arles. He climbs up this rocky hill called Montmajour and makes images from the top of this hill. So it seems like Van Gogh's move to Arles and his time there is, again, this retreat into nature. But what I point out in the book is, in fact, a number of things. One, that required, or at least was facilitated by the railroad, because it was a long distance. Even on the train, it took 16 hours, the better part of a day. So it was a long trip. Secondly, once he's there, he doesn't have his network of family and friends for support. And anyone who knows Van Gogh's biography knows he was constantly hitting up people, particularly his beloved brother Theo, for funds. So he's dependent on the railway for sending letters back and forth. He's sending paintings and drawings to Theo on the train. Theo's sending art supplies. And I talk about this in the first chapter, that I think the appearance of the railroad in his Arles work, more than in any other place he had lived up to that time, may be registering his recognition of how important it had become to him. So again, what I'm really trying to get at throughout the book is that, one, we have Van Gogh making images of a lot of these industrial elements, again, smokestacks, factories, trains, coal mines, but also what I try to get across in the book in any number of different ways, including in this discussion of the railroad, is that all of these aspects of the modern industrial experience are kind of the understructure of Van Gogh's life and work that we often don't recognize or take in.
It's interesting. A few months ago, I spoke with a person about the life of a contemporary artist named Ray Johnson, who leaves Manhattan, moves out to Long Island, and after his death, which similarly is considered a suicide, they try to piece together a documentary about his life. And the people that knew him best were the postmen that were delivering things to him nonstop, because he was the father of mail art. And so people were constantly sending him things. He was constantly sending things out. And so the one person, kind of this Citizen Kane sort of story, the person that knew him best was the postman. And we see the same thing in Van Gogh. Like, Joseph Rouland is this conduit to Theo because all of the stuff that's coming off of the train, the supplies, the letters back and forth, that all kind of funneled through the postman.
Yes. And first of all, I think the comparison with the artist Ray Johnson is lovely. I hadn't thought about that before, but of course, both of them, I think both Van Gogh and Ray Johnson were very difficult people. I think they struggled a lot with kind of social interactions at times, but they were both fiercely devoted to their art. And one of the things I try to do in the book around Joseph Rouland is just kind of, again, reorient people's thinking about it, because I think a lot of times the relationship between him and Van Gogh is kind of treated sort of sentimentally. But as I point out, he was crucial to, and as you're pointing out, he was crucial to Van Gogh's life, but also network once he moved to Arles. And he was, as you're pointing out, and as I discussed sort of extensively in the book, I think a lot of people think that he was a mail carrier, but he was working at the train station. And he was a crucial conduit for Van Gogh to receive packages, to send things off to Theo and other people. In fact, after Van Gogh's dissolution and the ear incident, Theo sends money to Rouland to pay for the rent on the yellow house, and he pays by postal order. So this was someone who was actually really useful to Van Gogh, just in terms of sort of his functioning, and he was deeply tied to the railroad. So again, these are ways for me to keep emphasizing to the reader how much Van Gogh was deeply immersed and embedded in what we would call modernity and industrial modernity in all sorts of ways that I think we tend not to realize, or that oftentimes we screen out. And I just want to say a little bit about that. I was talking to another art historian yesterday who's a specialist in 19th century art, and we were talking about Van Gogh as someone to write about. And it's challenging because the biography looms so large and people are so invested in these myths, right? The ear incident, the yellow house, the hospital, the asylum. Was he crazy? What was the reason for his difficulties? People have become, I think, so invested in those myths, those biographical myths, that it's easy for us to lose sight. And I said a version of this earlier. It's just easy for us to lose sight that he was like all of us, right? He was a human individual living at a particular moment in time. And actually, as I was thinking about talking to you today, this morning I was thinking about it, and I think the best analogy is for us to imagine writing in 50 or 100 years about an artist right now and claim that that the digital age, the internet, social media had no impact on them, right? That they were that they were somehow completely separated from those things. Now, maybe there are a few people like that, but I think it's the same. I think what I'm trying to do in this book is the same thing with Van Gogh, to say, no, he wasn't just like living in a hut in the woods, studying the leaves and the birds, right? And this is the thing, that the myth of him as the crazy wild man, and I think this is one of the significant downsides of that part of the myth, really overshadows him and sells him short. He was an incredibly cosmopolitan individual. Yes, did he have difficulties? Yes, did he chafe against social norms? Absolutely. But this was someone who spent years and in fact had deep connections through his family with the art market, right? I want contemporary art dealers and artists to know that Van Gogh was someone who understood the market, both through Theo, who was a very savvy art dealer, but also through his own experience. Van Gogh worked at this gallery called the Goupil Gallery. If you read Van Gogh's letters, he's constantly talking about marketing, circulating his work. When he paints one of his earliest major works, The Potato Eaters, when he's in the small town of Noonan, living with his parents, he makes a print of it precisely to send. He's not going to send the painting, to send the print and impressions of the print to Theo to maybe get it out in the world, right? He wants eyes on it. So I think a lot of these myths do a disservice to our understanding of the complexity and nuance of this person as an artist and their work. And I would like my book to be just one chapter in a kind of broader attempt to really get people to rethink how we understand him. And then, most importantly, to me, to look again at his work and say, you said, we could have a drinking game, like pick out the smokestacks in his work. But it is true that once you look at those works, and particularly from Arles, oh yeah, he's on this rocky hill of Montmajour outside of Arles. He's looking out on the landscape. Sometimes he talks about seeing nature, and yet he's really carefully including signs of industry. And what I would say as an art historian is a lot of the response that a lot of people would say is, well, that's just what was there, right? And so and anyone who knows how artists work know that that's not the case. First of all, he could have just shifted his gaze, 10 feet to the left or 10 feet to the right and screened them out. He could have put a cloud there, right? Or he could have edited those things out completely. But he seems to have quite deliberately included these structures in his works. There's a painting at the Hammer Museum in LA now by Van Gogh called The Sower. And I think Van Gogh there is very deliberately showing us a sower and then a farmer creating rows in the earth. And then in the background, these hulking industrial structures and smokestacks. I think Van Gogh was being deliberate about this.
I guess the majority of the narrative I had input about his biography, I knew about the time at seminary and his inability to get a pastoral job because of his quirkiness and, what led him to kind of escape Paris and take up this monastic life as a painter. But I had missed the part in the biography where he spends 2 years in London. That was kind of a revelation to me, and I don't know why. I don't know how I skipped that chapter, but it's really interesting to me as you lay this out that there in 1873, he's spending 2 years in the middle of the pea soup. Can you kind of describe for us exactly how treacherous the environmental conditions were in London at that time, and maybe how that was something that would have impacted his worldview?
Absolutely, I can do that. So, and I think I've again been thinking about this a lot in terms of talking to people about the book. So again, getting back to what I was just sort of describing about the biography, I think the focus both on Van Gogh as this kind of quasi-mythical figure, but then also on all of these kind of details and oftentimes lurid details of his biography, oftentimes pull us away from just the kind of everyday circumstances of the world he was living in, right? Like, we have him, his time in Belgium as a lay preacher, he kind of rends his clothes and exists on gruel and stuff like that. But there are also circumstances that he was living in. So at various points in the book, what I tried to do is kind of zoom out a little and think about, not just Vincent van Gogh, the quasi-mythic figure, but what was he living in and through? And Craig, what you're referring to is a point in kind of early 1870s. And by the way, he was living in London in this period at various points and also Paris. before he returns to Paris in the 1880s and sort of really immerses himself in the art world at that time. So in kind of trying to place Van Gogh in that world of the 19th century and 1870s, I just started doing research on London in that period. And I identified something that I don't think anyone else has kind of identified, again, because I think most people are either focusing on the biography or details of his art, which is he was living in London and working at this gallery during one of the absolutely worst bouts that London experienced in the 19th century of air pollution. And it's in late 1873. It lasted, I think, at least a week. And it was known as the cattle show fog because there was an annual, and once you get into the details of this stuff, it's harrowing. And you start thinking, oh, wait a minute, Van Gogh was living through these intense periods of air pollution and other types of pollution. But in late 1873, the city of London was beset by this terrible fog. London had long been beset by fogs, but particularly in the industrial age in the 19th century, because of all the burning of coal and smokestacks, it started experiencing these sulfur-laden fogs, which were known as P-supers, not S-U-P-E-R-S, but S-O-U-P-E-R-S, because the sulfur created these intense, noxious, heavy green fogs. And it was known as the cattle show fog because it occurred during this annual cattle show in London, and all of these cattle expired because of how horrible the pollution was that week. And I think I don't include it in the book, but I think there's an anecdote that the Queen's prized bull also died because of this pollution. And it was really interesting as a historian. I mean, I'm an art historian, but I also see myself as a historian. I'm interested in how artists live through history, to just read and kind of really immerse myself in accounts of that period. Flowers fell off the vine. Anyone and people today, I think, can relate to this. People who suffered from respiratory issues got very sick. Many of them died. I think I give the number in the book. I think it's something there were like 800 or so excess deaths just in that week because of the air pollution. And so Van Gogh was there. Van Gogh was there for one of the most intense and terrible, and from all accounts, sort of terrifying episodes of air pollution in London, if not in Europe, in that period. He was working at that gallery. He would have been walking back and forth to work every day. My point is that Vincent van Gogh, this artist we know so well for his trees and sunflowers and cypresses and starry night skies, would have been absolutely familiar with what air pollution was like and what the worst kinds of air pollution was like. And one thing I want to say is partly I'm telling this story because it makes this person and this artist, I think, more connected to what we're going through right now. As we're talking right now, I'm in New York City. It's June 2024, and large swaths of the United States are covered with a heat dome. And so I want to make Van Gogh an artist who has some resonance with our own time and who understood the ravages that industry and pollution could impact, how pollution and industry could impact the world really, really negatively.
I think it's also interesting as I'm reading the book, when you start describing life in Arles, Van Gogh gives us a visual representation of that space. But if we could only smell what that community smelled like, we would have a totally different impression. And it was interesting. Just yesterday, I was reading an article about a new Henry VIII film called Firebrand that Jude Law has been working on. And he and the filmmaker wanted to create as authentic a setting for capturing Henry VIII as possible. And he had a perfume specialist create a blend of blood, fecal matter, and sweat, because he was literally rotting, open sores, so that people could capture this whole. People would swoon over the king at the same time they were being repulsed, right? And so seeing Arles, we're only getting the swooning. We don't get the repulsion that the people there in that moment would have been dealing with. Can you kind of talk about what exactly was going on in Arles that would have totally make us want to leave?
So there are a number of instances. First of all, I want to say, I don't think I would want to be on that film set with the perfume that you just described. But I think what you're picking up on, and I'll just back up and say, I'm an art historian. I've written a number of scholarly books before this, and I want people to know that this is a book that I wrote for a general readership. It's serious. I did enormous amounts of research, but there are also, and I really try to treat the material very seriously, but also there are lighthearted moments, because that's me. I'm goofy and funny, and I don't take everything seriously. And I think what you're referring to is, I have a moment in the book where I'm talking about this canal in Arles that both Van Gogh and Gauguin side by side paint, called the Rubin du Roi. And I say that we should be glad that their pictures of this canal don't come in scratch and sniff versions. Because in fact, when we go back and do the historical research, the way that this canal was described in that period was as a sewer, as an open air sewer. And I want to actually but this is a really great way of actually sort of defending my position in the book about taking seriously Van Gogh as an artist who is really looking at the impacts of industry on the world and nature. Gauguin, as many people know, Van Gogh in Arles sets up what he calls the Studio of the South. He leaves Paris, but he really thinks maybe this can be almost a kind of artist community. And he thinks about a number of artists to invite, but he really wants Paul Gauguin. And Gauguin puts it off for a while and eventually arrives in the autumn of 1888. They spend, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's 9 weeks together. And as most people who know the myths of Van Gogh or the stories of Van Gogh know, it does not end well. It ends with the ear incident and Vincent in the hospital. But before that, while they're together, they go out and paint side by side a lot. And actually, I can talk about two of the sites that they paint. One of them is this canal. This canal, the Rubin du Roi. And what's interesting is, and again, supporting Van Gogh's kind of attunement, is that Gauguin turns away from all the industrial elements. He makes these scenes of laundresses on the banks, but he seems very deliberately to turn away from industry, whereas Van Gogh actually includes this big gasworks that was on the outskirts of the city, outside the city walls, but was alongside the canal. So to anyone who's saying, oh, this art historian, Michael Lobel, he's coming in here, with his polemical position and he's forcing it on Van Gogh. No, just look at chapter 3, which is categorized under the heading or the title Water, and compare Gauguin and Van Gogh's approach to the same subject. And Van Gogh looks square on at the gasworks, includes it in his scenes, and the gasworks was incredibly polluting and was one of the major reasons that canal was polluted. Similarly, there's this sort of park-like setting in Arles that was well known to travelers, and Gauguin and Van Gogh also painted side by side. And in one of his pictures, which is in the book, Van Gogh places this big smokestack and some structures in the scene alongside, these pathways with trees and plantings and people sort of strolling by. And he even goes so far, you and I talked about smokestacks, and they really play a part in the first chapter of the book. He even goes so far as to add these sort of looping, trailing trails of smoke coming out of those tall chimneys. Now, what were those? Similarly to what you're talking about scratch and sniff and really getting a different sensation of that site, Van Gogh and Gauguin only leave us with pictures, visual, but we do have other evidence. The novelist Henry James visits that same site. I think it's a few years earlier. And he talks about strolling through these kind of quasi-bucolic lanes and alleys of trees. But he says there's this din of loud, noisy hammering. And it was these railway workshops. So the railway was not only important for Arles and the south of France for bringing people from Paris and other points north down through Arles and other cities to the south of France. But also there were enormous railway workshops, which were among the biggest employers of citizens of the town at the time. So you're right. We don't need to blame anyone for kind of misunderstandings or limited understandings of an artist like Van Gogh. It's partly a result of the fact that paintings and drawings, as you said, they don't smell usually. They don't have sound usually. And so we can look at historical works of art and make assumptions based on what we're seeing. But I think the wonderful thing about what I do, my field, art history, which I'm deeply devoted to, is that it can help all of us kind of reconstruct with a little bit more nuance what it was like in the moment when works of art were made.
It kind of makes you reconsider all of the narratives about fleeing to a bucolic natural setting of solitude and fresh air when that's not the case at all, right? You mentioned the gasworks. The gasworks were a bit of a blessing and a curse. Can you kind of talk about the advent of gas lamps and how that was impacting that environment?
Absolutely. So I'm very excited about this book. And one of the sections that I'm most excited about is chapter 3, which comes under the heading of fire. And actually, let me just step back and say the book is divided into 5 sections. The first 4 sections are the 4 elements: air, earth, fire, and water. Then chapter 5 is color. And for me, this was a way of signaling the kinds of reversals I want the book to do as a whole, which is usually when we think about the 4 elements and even color, but particularly the 4 elements, we think, oh, that's nature. But in the book, what I do is use each of the 4 elements to signal industry and pollution. So air is in fact smokestacks and air pollution. Earth is actually mining and excavation. And fire is gaslight. And I'm really excited about this because, as it turns out, gaslight was incredibly important to Van Gogh. And in fact, I make this suggestion, and I'm very serious about this, that we should think of a certain period of Van Gogh's career, several months in Arles, just before the ear incident, in fact. I think we should call that the gaslight period. Just like as anyone who's taken introduction to art history in college or introduction to modern art or read a little bit, people know that Picasso had the blue period and the rose period. I think very seriously we should know that span of time in Van Gogh's career as his gaslight period, because in fact, gaslight becomes central to his work. It becomes central to his thinking about some of the most important aspects of his work as a painter, which are light and color. And he actually takes steps to use gaslight. He has it installed in the Yellow House. And so I then take a step back and say, okay, well, what was gaslight? It was an enormously impactful development in the 19th century. It basically inaugurated the modern era of artificial illumination. It's sort of, and again, kind of trying to bring this book and our understanding of Van Gogh up to the present. You know, anyone who's ever stayed up until 2, 3, 4 in the morning, right? Whether out at a club or at home, like, you know, at their laptop or using their phone to play a game, our 24/7 experience of the world in some ways starts with the 19th century introduction of widespread artificial illumination. And Van Gogh was fascinated with gaslight. He, like some other artists at the time, he became really interested in how gaslight changed the color of things, because it typically had this kind of yellowish color. But what I talk about in the book is how, in contrast to some of these other artists, like Georges Seurat, the kind of pointillist or divisionist, unlike other artists of the time who were interested in gaslight, Van Gogh did something very interesting with it, which is he started thinking about it relationally, which is he started thinking about artificial illumination in relation to natural illumination. So while most people who know Van Gogh know probably his most iconic painting, which is The Starry Night, which is this incredible starry sky over this small village. What seems to have been Van Gogh's first attempt at a starry night sky was a painting of a cafe terrace in Arles, and it very deliberately places the stars in the sky, which are on the upper right, against this large, in fact, Van Gogh in a letter called it immense, gas lamp hanging over the terrace. And I really think all of these things were deliberate for Van Gogh. So if you look at the Café Terrace painting, which is now in the Kröller-Müller Museum in the Netherlands, and by the way, there are untold interpretations of this painting. I've read interpretations that it somehow has relationships to the Last Supper. I'm going to set those aside. If you just look at the Café Terrace painting and see what Van Gogh did, it's interesting because he took this terrace of a cafe, there are tables and chairs and people, but he pushed all the people into the background. And so in the foreground, all you have is a few tables and chairs, and then this immense gas lamp emitting this light. And so the picture really becomes a composition of light against light. The gas lamp in the foreground in the lower left, and the starry night sky in the upper right. So what I say in the book, and I really am behind saying this, is that when people go to MoMA or just in a book look at the iconic Starry Night painting, I want them to know that Van Gogh's thinking about this motif started out with him thinking about artificial illumination, specifically gaslight. And in fact, if you look, I've been thinking about the iconic Starry Night because I'm writing something a little bit about it. And if you look at the Starry Night painting, down below in the village, there are all of these little windows that are lit up. And we don't know what kind of illumination there is in them, but there again, he's thinking about different types of illumination and putting them in contrast or in relationship.
You mentioned that you have the elements and then color. The conversation about color isn't necessarily a conversation about what we would anticipate. It's not the chapter we would have anticipated. It's really a conversation about what is going on in the synthetic, man-made world of colors that is really just an incredibly toxic environment. And I've always been one that has thought that I guess I'm a bit of an amateur historian also, and I think in terms of connectedness, like how do things connect together? And I look at all the symptoms that Van Gogh is kind of purporting at that point in his life, and I think of his massive use of lead, white, and heavy metals and arsenic and all these things. Like there's no telling what sort of impact that could have had on his mental state. But can you talk a little bit about just what a toxic environment synthetic colors were, especially in that day and age when they were just at the precipice of learning how to, and just the stories about how they were kind of willy-nilly beginning to use these synthetic colors in food materials is also just incredibly shocking.
Yeah, so I'd say that, again, to put in a plug for art history, I feel really lucky to do this because in writing a book like this, I go down a lot of different rabbit holes, and it can be really fascinating. And one of those threads that I pursued for a while, which relate to Van Gogh, relates to these things called the coal tar colors. Now, I should be presenting myself as an expert who knows everything in advance, but that's not the case. And really, before researching this book, I was not familiar with them. But in the 19th century, there are this series of discoveries around this substance called coal tar. It's called coal tar because it's a byproduct of coal processing. It's this oozing, viscous, dark matter. It's earlier on had been considered a waste product. And then suddenly, scientists and inventors start experimenting with it. In fact, the best known of these was known as William Henry Perkin. And they realized they could start distilling all of these materials out of it. Perkin realizes he can get this pigment, which he dubs mauve, right? He creates this pigment that becomes a sensation. And I talk in the book, aspirin comes out of coal tar. TNT, the explosive, comes out of coal tar. It's really the start of like our petrochemical plastic world. And so there are hundreds of different pigments that are developed out of coal tar, the so-called coal tar colors. And Van Gogh does use them in his work. And I spend the last full chapter of the book talking about color in Van Gogh's work, again, not as a product of the natural world, but as a product of industry. And I think there are a number of takeaways that we can take from that. One, again, to see him as a fully modern individual. Also to see him connected to some of our own most pressing concerns with pollution and environmental despoliation. But finally, what I talk about at the very end of the book is that Van Gogh's use of some of these pigments now impacts literally how we see his work. So I want to make this clear to people. And in fact, there's going to be an exhibition this fall of 2024, at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles around Van Gogh's Irises painting, which is in the collection of the Getty Museum, and its color changes. And what I tried to do in the book, there's a lot of writing in the last few decades about this subject by conservation scientists. So you read these in these specialized journals, right? That even I, as an art historian, don't usually look at. And I read a lot of the articles written by those conservation scientists and then tried to translate them for a broader audience. And the takeaway is when you go to a museum and see Van Gogh's work, oftentimes you're not seeing what he left when he painted the painting. Now, part of this is because artists have used materials for almost as long as art has existed that degrade, right? And yet the adoption of these new artificial pigments created new problems. And again, someone might come along and say, oh, this art historian, Michael Lobel, he's just sort of imposing this on Van Gogh's work. Well, sorry, people, as the internet meme, if anyone knows the internet meme with Joan Collins, I have the receipts, or Whitney Houston, show me the receipts. Okay, we have the receipts, because if you look at Van Gogh's letters, he talks about knowing that, for instance, the pigment geranium lake, which was based on the coal tar color eosin, he knew it degraded. He knew it wasn't light fast. And he, in fact, at one point says, okay, I have to up the intensity of my color because I know it's going to fade. And I end the final full chapter of the book with a series of drawings that Van Gogh made. He's in Arles. He goes up to this rocky hill of Montmajour. He does these lovely drawings of the hill. There's a ruined abbey. There are these rocky outcroppings. But he decides to use a purple ink. And the main pigment of the purple ink comes from a material called methyl violet, which is another coal tar color. And we have photographs of those drawings from about 100 years ago where you can see the drawings. And now when the drawings are reproduced, they're almost entirely faded. So we've always known that artist materials can be light sensitive, but the introduction of these new artificial pigments, really up the ante even more. And what I try to point out is that this can be a warning for us, right? That and we're seeing this right now, right? With global warming and climate change and all of the devastating consequences, us humans can be very short-sighted. We can focus very easily on short-term goals rather than long-term consequences. And Van Gogh might be, giving us, not intentionally, but Van Gogh might be a warning of those moments when we're told and we know, that something may happen or that there may be consequences for our choices, but we ignore them, right? So it's me thinking, okay, let's not just think about him as this avatar or embodiment of nature and the expressive force of art, but someone who is occasionally making choices in his own time about the materials he was using that had a negative impact on how his artworks have lasted. So at the very least, the takeaway is when people go and look at his art in a museum or even in reproduction, oftentimes you may not be seeing what he left at the time he made the work. And that may have been due to his immersion and engagement with the modern industrial world.
I had a conversation, I guess probably about a year and a half now, about a show that was up at the MFA Boston at the Kimball Museum called Turner's Modern World. And very much a show that was crafted a lot like your book about Van Gogh, but what was JMW Turner seeing and what was he representing in the emerging age of steam power and the locomotive? And I mean, I think that there is bound to be interest on the curatorial side to be able to put a show like this together. I mean, your book really does seem like the framework for a major museum show. I hope you're able to get some traction there. And I don't know if that was even your goal in the beginning, but it just seems like the logical next step.
Well, actually, I want to say, sort of in response to your mentioning of that exhibition on Turner, I do want to point out, and I do want to give credit, like my work doesn't come out of nowhere, right? So a few years ago, there was a show in Canada on impressionism and industry. There's been enormous amounts of writing in recent years in my field of art history of people doing what's called eco-criticism, thinking about how we can reframe and rethink the history of art through a kind of environmentalist or ecological lens. I'm just pulling a lot of existing threads and also adding some new insights, because I think I hear what you're saying and I agree with you. And it's sort of what I'm trying to do in the book is bring Van Gogh into that light based on what people have been discussing, people have been trying to do in their own work. And also, really crucially for me, to make him relevant to what we're going through right now. Because if we maintain this image of the Van Gogh as cypresses and sunflowers and wheat fields and sort of pure, unmediated, starry skies, he's sort of separated from what we're going through right now. And for many of us, this awareness and consciousness about the detrimental impacts of industry and human activity on the world. But what I'm trying to do in the book is say that if we place him back in the industrial context that he actually lived and worked in and that appears in his work, I hope he becomes more relevant to us. He moves from being this kind of distant figure in the 19th century out in the fields to maybe someone who can really resonate with us and with our current circumstances and maybe even provide us some lessons.
Michael, I really appreciate you giving me an hour of your time to have a conversation about your work. Thank you for taking the time to write this book, in the course of your busy schedule at Hunter College. And, golly, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I really enjoyed the book. The book's Van Gogh and the End of Nature. And I think by the time the podcast is up, it will be available just about anywhere someone's looking for a book. So, Michael, thanks for your time.
Greg, thank you so much.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.